we are following the latest developments in Indonesia, where the country is struggling to recover from a devastating earthquake and tsunami. Around 70,000 people have been displaced following last month's tragedy, and we're taking a closer look at how people react to these deadly disasters. Psychology professor Jamil Zaki wrote an article in The Atlantic called Indonesia's Tsunami and the Problem of Human Empathy, focusing on why people lack genuine emotions following these types of situations. And Jamil is joining us to talk about that article. He's an assistant professor at Stanford University Psychology Department. Good to have you.
Thanks for having me.
So, Jamil, in your article, you cite a number of studies that show people donate more to charity after learning about one person as compared to many people in need. Why is that?
Yeah, so that's a phenomenon known as compassion collapse, and it's very confusing. It feels kind of morally backwards, right? We should technically care more about 100 suffering people than one suffering person, because 100 people can suffer more than one person can. But we get the opposite effect in, again, what psychologists call compassion collapse. One sort of reason that this might happen is that our emotions aren't necessarily built to connect with hundreds or thousands of people. We've evolved to care about each other, but that care has evolved to sort of be triggered by certain cues, an anguished face or a child's cry. And statistics like hearing that 70,000 people have been displaced in Indonesia simply might not trigger our emotions in the same way that one person might.
So I have a question regarding the sort of the 24-hour news cycle. I mean, covering these tragedies like the earthquake, tsunami in Indonesia, or what we've seen happening just here in the United States can be overwhelming for a lot of people. On the other hand, we know that during the 1960s, when those images of African Americans being attacked by dogs and police hoses went out on the airwaves, for many Americans who had not realized what was happening in some of these cities down south, that spurred them to action, including politicians. So has there been a difference between what happened then and what happens now, in that we now have a 24-hour news cycle and we're constantly being bombarded with images of mostly generally negative news?
Yeah, it's a really great question. There was a poll put out by Reuters earlier this year that suggested that up to 70% of Americans have what we call news fatigue, which is that they're just so inundated with negative emotion that, we don't feel in a way that we can process it anymore. And that exhaustion makes it hard to mobilize ourselves for collective action, even when the suffering around us really should move us to do something.
And you also write in your article about the consequences of compassion collapse. You say that the 2015 migrant crisis and how human empathy shapes global policies sort of were part of what you were looking into.
That's right. There's a very famous case of compassion collapse in what we would call the identifiable victim effect that came out during that crisis. So there was a small boy named Alan Kurdi. He was 3, and his family tried to cross from Turkey into Greece. They were fleeing the crisis in Syria. And he died, he drowned during that trip. And images, you might recall, of his body washed up on the shore kind of rocketed around the internet and produced a kind of wildfire of philanthropy and care. Donations to Syrian refugees skyrocketed for about a month. And then they dropped off back to their kind of baseline levels, even though thousands, hundreds of thousands of other children, just like Alan, continued to suffer, right? So we had this moment where the world kind of coalesced around empathy for one child, but then we couldn't maintain that empathy for the plight of many other children just like him.
I remember that very vividly, and I wonder if part of the compassion collapse has to do with a couple of things. Number one, the fact that the Syrian civil war has been ongoing now for more than 7 years, and so that child became sort of the, for everybody, for a lot of people who are not in the news business, it was like, oh my God, there are real people that are being affected by this. And it's not just images that we see in the news. You have this one haunting picture of this child. And on the other hand, for people, there's a great distance between the United States, if we're using Americans as an example, and between here and there. And so sometimes it's easier to care about people that are in your own neighborhood, in your own state, as opposed to people that are thousands of miles away.
It certainly feels that way. I would argue that it's not so much about physical distance, but rather psychological distance. So people care about the images that they see on the news, the people whose voices they hear, the kind of cues that we get about other people's emotions. You're absolutely right that we tend to get those cues more from people in our neighborhood than people far away. But one of the amazing things about social media and the internet is it actually makes other people's emotions available to us, even if they're on the other side of the world. The problem is, as you mentioned earlier, that there's so much of an opportunity to connect with other people's emotions that we can easily be overwhelmed and decide in a way to shut down instead of continuing to connect.
And finally, let me just ask you this, Jamil. How do we define caring? I mean, you can have people who say, wow, this is terrible. You may even have people who shed tears over seeing an image of children, in a chemical weapons attack or, in an earthquake or, I mean, people still cry when they see images of the Holocaust. But what does caring actually mean? Does it mean we donate money and then we forget about it? Does it mean that we, quit our jobs and devote our time to helping people in crisis? I mean, how do you define caring?
Well, so it's a really good question. In the science of empathy, which is what I focus on, we talk about different flavors of empathy. So you might become distressed by someone else's pain and really just want to stop feeling bad yourself. And one way to stop feeling bad is just to donate and forget about it. There's another sort of type of caring known as empathic concern or compassion, where you really develop a goal to make another person feel better, to relieve their suffering, or to help them be happier. And that's a sort of more sustaining emotion that tends to drive people to longer lasting philanthropy. I think in terms of what actions we can take, what actions matter, sure, quitting our job and becoming full-time sort of social workers or going into disaster areas and trying to help, that would be fantastic. I don't think most of us can even begin to imagine doing that. But I think that the question that we should all ask ourselves is, to what extent can we keep our empathy turned on? To what extent do we want to make a difference? And how can we leverage our emotions to point us in that direction, to point us in the direction that will inspire us to do something for someone else?
And real quick, because we got about 30 seconds, but I guess what you're saying, it's really interesting to me, is that you may not be able to help, for example, a child in Syria directly other than by donating. But what if somebody who's a young person decides to join the military because of some of the images that they've seen? They're not directly affecting that child or those group of migrants or those refugees, but they decide to reorient their lives to doing something because of some of the things that they've seen and witnessed. Is that sort of what you're hinting at?
Yeah, I mean, one person's suffering can inspire us to help people like that individual through the choices that we make, not just to donate money, but in the way that we spend our time and what we do with our lives.
All right. Thank you, Jamil Zaki. Really important stuff.
Thanks very much.